So I don't even know what to say about that introduction. Obviously, Clark has never spoken to any of my editors. But I do thank you for the honor of being here, and especially the honor of sharing a stage with student journalists who are so much more sophisticated than I was at that age. I played around with other titles for this talk. I like the romance of the word renegade, but rebel without a clue would probably be more like it. Candid memoir of my high school newspaper adventures would be how to get fired without quite trying. I don't want to alarm anyone, but you should know that my lawyers are here tonight. Not the ones who represented me in high school, although I'm sorry they couldn't make it. I'll get to them later. I'm talking about Jay Kennedy and Jim McLaughlin from the Washington Post, and I didn't know it was coming, but their predecessor, Bo Jones, and as far as I can tell, they pretty much follow me everywhere in case someone lunges toward me with a subpoena. We've had a hell of a year together on this Snowden story, and they're exactly the kind of lawyers you want at your back. These days I don't do very many speaking gigs. I'm trying to write a book, and talking about work is not working, it turns out. But I had no choice tonight. First, my old friend Mary Stapp, strong-armed me. She's a member of the board, and her husband is an old friend of mine as well, Joel Achenbach from the Post. And then Frank LaMotte told me that Mike Simpson was going to be here. So this is Mike, circa 1979, and he still looks exactly and sounds exactly the same. He had Frank's job way back in the 20th century when a teenage know-it-all from Philadelphia got into a jam. Mike not only found me legal help, but hired me the next summer as an intern. Mike, I owe you. So that summer turned out to be the first time I got to edit a paper that wasn't burned on arrival. But that's getting ahead of my story. The cover art was by my fellow intern, the amazing Bob Stack, whose work you've all seen somewhere, whether it's the New Yorker or his many books. He also did Mike Simpson's cartoon. He's here tonight. Welcome, Bob. I've always loved your work, except that one time. You couldn't give me a break with the unibrow? So I came here to tell a story. I should probably start where it began. And by the way, Dave Danner, our other fellow interns here, and I didn't know he was coming, or I would have found an embarrassing photo of him as well. So here's where it began. Sometimes life hands you a moment of truth for real, and I got mine at the age of 16. I looked in the mirror and I said to myself, son, you're just not a very good gymnast. Actually, that was Coach Fogel, the day he cut me from the junior varsity team. Point was, I had to look for something else to do. So I stumbled upon the excellent news that you don't need chiseled abs to write for the paper. Now, the Town Crier was kind of a dopey name. And it wasn't exactly the Washington Post. But the idea of newspapering, and this is what Audie was talking about before, this free pass to ask questions and find stuff out and tell people about it the way you think it ought to be told, that appealed to me a lot. And against not a whole lot of competition that year, I got the editor's job at the end of junior year. So that summer, I spent a few days in New York with my co-editors, Craig Snyder and Robert Gordon. Columbia Journalism School ran a workshop for high school editors then, and it still does. So here we were, real reporters and real editors and real college professors were talking to us about real journalism. We learned how to dig, how to verify, how to hold the powers that be accountable, or we learned at least a few steps along that road. And we also picked up a few points of law. And I'm amazed to be in the same room with the tinker of Tinker Against Des Moines. I read that thing through many times. It was an inspiration. We were kids, but we had constitutional rights. We were liberated. We felt powerful. We were going to be investigative reporters. Just for example, this Broadway poster was everywhere in New York that summer. And somebody told us the whole cast was bare naked on stage for 2 whole hours. So we investigated. I am proud to say we verified every word of that story. So, on a related note, at Columbia, we also learned about a case called Gambino against Fairfax. It was all about naked people and sex and birth control. These things were largely hypothetical to me at the time, but I was willing to learn. My friends and I were ambitious. We wanted our first issue to announce, there was this feeling like a new sheriff in town. We were going to be provocative, lawful, nothing out of bounds. But we wanted to make a statement, and the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals in Gambino had dropped that story into our lap. It certified, and this was our idea, it certified a First Amendment right to talk about teenage pregnancy in print. As Fairfax went, so would go George Washington High School. And if the principal didn't like it, I imagined this scene where I'd pull out a copy of Gambino and place it with a flourish on her desk. So, the principal. She was an ex-gym teacher, way taller than me, who lived by the maxim that the prince leads better by fear than by love. So in the movie version, she would have had a really scary name that hinted at dark days to come. And that's her actual name. Sometimes life just hands it right to you. And I was scared of her, but I was 16 years old and I knew everything. Okay, I see I have to explain about the hair. All right, so the big show on TV was Welcome Back, Kotter. And this guy, Juan, got all the girls. So you see where I'm going with this. Anyway, back to our big brainstorm. We thought ahead. What was the worst thing Dr. Wacker could do? We figured, well, the worst thing is she'd tell the school print shop not to print the new Town Crier's bold journalistic debut, and that would really suck. So, we got an answer. We spent the rest of the summer selling ads, and we hired an outside printer. For those of you under 25, this is kind of a prototype of the internet. It's a machine that makes blogs out of trees. So we signed a contract with the printer. It was our Declaration of Independence. So by now you may be wondering, did these kids have no adult supervision at all? So this is Renee Goldman, our faculty advisor, and that's her shell-shocked inscription in my yearbook. I was far too young and self-involved to understand the risks she took for us. Renee was not a reckless woman. Going up against Dr. Wacker was nothing short of that. All summer, Renee kept our secret about the ads and the outside printer, and she knew the stories we were planning too, and she didn't tell that either. So finally the day came. Volume 4, number 1 of the Town Crier went to press. No more happy talk. We were taking it to the man, holding up a mirror to those untidy garbage cans. Missing library books. Honestly, the stories weren't all that great, but they did one thing that reliably gets the attention of people in charge. It embarrassed them. So there's a joke I hear pretty often from national security types who deal with US government secrets every day. The highest form of classification, they say, top secret / embarrassing. That's the stuff you don't talk about. That's what you try to keep quiet so no one else can talk about it either. Dr. Wacker didn't care all that much for the budget story, but this isn't the one that got us in trouble. That would be the 3-story spread on sex and condoms and Planned Parenthood and all that stuff that was on the inside of the paper. Our secret plan was coming to fruition, and especially this one. Contraception, abortion. We were only a few years past Roe against Wade. I'm really old. And abortion was, if anything, even more controversial, more alive in the popular debate than it is today. We knew this story was going to make our principal's head explode. But we were sure we had her cornered. We had the law on our side. Nobody could defeat our brilliant plan to spread the light of journalism at George Washington. So Rena Gold offered one caution. State or local law, I forget which, forbade any counseling, quote unquote, about birth control or abortion. And the principal might seize on that point to stop us. No problem. We had an answer for everything. So we stuck this disclaimer at the top of the story. This is part of what I meant before about knowing just enough law to be dangerous. Take that, Dr. Wacker. Check and mate. So here's what actually happened. I'm going to dial back the story about a week. We cut it as close as we could, but sooner or later we had to tell the principal what was coming. She asked to see the contraception story, and it did not appeal to her. So I told her very earnestly all about Tinker and Gambino and how, of course, the Fourth Circuit holding wasn't dispositive here in the Third Circuit. I love big words. But it did suggest an emerging First Amendment jurisprudence she might want to consider, and would she like to read this handy pamphlet that I'd picked up at Columbia? No, she would not. So Carol Wacker was nobody's fool. You don't get to be principal of a big city school without learning what not to say in a meeting. So she stopped short of a direct order to kill the story. She gave us some advice. We should think about our choices, the consequences, a banquet of consequences, even. This was one of her favorite quotes from Robert Louis Stevenson. And this taught me a very valuable lesson, which has stayed with me to this day, because Robert Louis Stevenson did not actually say that. So, check and check again, young journalist. Quote, but verify. So, we decided to go ahead with the story. Printers set the type and burned the plates and rolled the presses. They have a button for that now on Tumblr. And exactly a week after our meeting with Dr. Wacker, she picked up the phone. See that name at the top of the masthead, she asked the printer? George Washington High School. I'm the principal. I'm sending somebody over. And she did. And they picked up all the papers that we had paid for and destroyed the plates. You don't have a digital backup in offset printing. The plates are the plates. You can't print a paper without them. Well, I didn't see that coming. Then came the part where Dr. Wacker fired us as editors. You sound familiar from before? Closed our office, shut the paper down. So, you're jobless, keyless, and paperless. Who are you going to call? No, not these guys. You're going to call the SPLC. I called Mike Simpson. I was pretty worked up. There's this lady, and she took our paper, and Gambino, and Tinker, and Schoolhouse Gate, and what are you going to do about it, Mike? I wish I could have seen the expression on his face. We hadn't met yet, but he stayed with me. And he knew just who to call in Philadelphia. And he said they'd fix me up with a lawyer, and he'd track the case and do whatever he could to help. I made the call. And in fact, the ACLU of Pennsylvania did come through just as Mike predicted. Got us a lawyer. Law professor, actually. I tried to get him here tonight. In fact, he got us 2 lawyers. Sharon Hosensky was Joe's fellow professor at Temple. And the thing is, the way we figured it, we barely needed a lawyer apart from formalities. Because we knew all about the law, and the case was open and shut. Joe and Sharon thought we were adorable. But in other ways, they took us very seriously. I mean, not as seriously as we took ourselves. But they showed us the Temple Law Library, and they put us to work. And the next few months, we kind of became our own paralegal support. It's not exactly like having yourself as a client, the old expression, but halfway there. Joe and Sharon said we ought to find out if the school board was really on the principal's side. Anyway, we had to try that before we got to court. Next thing I knew, they had us in a meeting with the superintendent of schools of the District of Philadelphia. We made our case. We weren't looking for trouble, but this was something we thought he should not stand behind. The super did the bureaucratic thing. He punted. Next day, Dr. Wacker told us the board had decided. Thumbs down. You're finished as editors. The paper dies. Back of mine, I thought she was going to say, and the little dog, too. So right there, we've reached our decision point. No more big talk, no more playing at freedom fighter. Were we going to put some skin in the game, or were we going to walk away? That was actually a huge gift that Carol Wacker gave us, because we got to find out who we were, whether we really believed all that crap we were saying, and what we were prepared to risk to defend it. And I found out something in those last few days of October. It's not that I was especially brave, I really wasn't. And it's not exactly that I knew we were right. I did know that, I thought I did, but being right isn't all it's cracked up to be. What I found out is that I'm really stubborn. I found out that I'm allergic to arbitrary orders by people who think they're accountable to no one. And if I'm going to be honest, my ego was on the line. I didn't want to see myself as a lemming. I didn't want to say yes, ma'am, and march myself off the cliff along with my constitutional rights. So, what to do? My father was a reporter once, and he loves a good stunt. What you ought to do, he said, you ought to call a press conference. Are you kidding me? Who's going to come hear three kids mouth off about school? It turns out the answer was everyone. The local TV stations came, KYW News Radio, I still have their jingle in my head. We had 3 newspapers then in Philadelphia. The Evening Bulletin, the Daily News, Philadelphia Inquirer strips it across the top. They all showed up, they all wrote stories, which was great, apart from the permanent record of what kind of shirt we thought would make us look like grown-ups. New York Times picked up a wire story wherein the school board explained itself. The story was in poor taste. What other choice did they have? Worse, our story was inaccurate. It's not as though birth control and abortion are the only options. Spokesman told the Washington Star the kids can just keep their pants on. And the best way to make that pedagogical point was to seize all the newspapers and destroy them. 3 days later, Halloween, we filed the papers. Gellman against Wacker commenced. It is astonishing how naive I was. I thought we'd walk into the courthouse, smite the school board with the First Amendment, and emerge with a thundering order from the judge. So here's another life lesson. Courts are slow. Clean victories are rare. Hardly any cases actually get to verdict. Imagine them trying to try all those cases that get filed. We drew an old and cranky judge, senior judge. From the bench, he acknowledged that there was a technical, quote unquote, a technical violation of the Constitution. What does that even mean? But he didn't plan to rule on that, he said. He ordered us to try to reach a settlement. The principal and the school board knew something that had not occurred to me at all. They didn't have to win the case. They just had to run out the clock. Headlines fade. Seniors graduate. Problem solved. So now, about that banquet of consequences. Right around the time we went to court, college application deadlines approached. My mother was the first to ask, what's the high school recommendation going to say? Good question, Mom. So once again, I had a brilliant plan. There's a checkbox on the recommendation form that asks whether you want to waive your right to see what the recommender writes. No way was I going to check that box. The truth is, I doubted that Dr. Wacker would actually try to hurt one of her students' college prospects. As I mentioned before, I was really naive. I thought I had her boxed in. If she wrote something nasty, I'd know it. I might even get to show it to the judge. Once again, Dr. Wacker outfoxed me. The Educational Records Act said I had a right to see my school files, but it didn't say the school has to keep them. My mother sent a written request for my recommendation. Dr. Wacker wrote back, all sweet as pie. She looked high and low, couldn't find it anywhere. Okay then, I'd have to take my chances with college. So I told myself, if Harvard doesn't have the stones to face my righteous First Amendment crusade, then I want nothing to do with the place anyway. And in fact, Harvard didn't take me. But it took a full year for me to find out what Wacker wrote about me. Colleges were subject to the same law, but it didn't kick in until I actually enrolled. So early in my freshman fall term, I walked into the admission office and asked to have a look. The good news was that Wacker told no lies. There was a 4-page form for the high school to fill out: courses, grades, honors, all this stuff. You know the form. Wacker left the entire thing blank, empty, except for one sentence and her signature. It's not fair to scream. I'm going to read it anyway. I do not feel as though I could give a recommendation that would be helpful toward Barton's acceptance by your institution. That was the whole thing. Well played, Wacker, well played. So I'm going to rewind now to the winter and spring of my last year in high school. So on the plus side, my friends and I had become a lot cooler than we used to be. We were suing the principal. Even the baseball captain said hi sometimes. Negotiations were slow, but it felt to me like we were winning. And here again, I got schooled by the other side. My friends and I were fixated on the principles of the thing. Wacker had no right to fire us and confiscate our paper. Wacker and the school board kept their eye on the facts on the ground. When the dust finally settled, they agreed. I could have my job back, and the Town Crier could distribute the paper in question. Score! Go Constitution! We won, right? Except the papers no longer existed. Wacker had burned them. We had an actual incinerator in the school. And technically, I could not get my job back because I was in college. The new editor, who was appointed by Wacker, was not inclined to reprint that paper or write anything else that might annoy her. I was an idiot. We had won nothing. Okay, that's supposed to say 10 years later. At the time I wrote this, I did not have a calculator with me. There's a newsroom saying, "Danger, reporter doing math." So Carol Wacker stayed on as principal and eventually was promoted to assistant superintendent, in charge of all the high schools in the city. She started going to public school conventions, explaining to administrators how to keep their student publications under control. So the Inquirer did a feature story in 1987. This is 10, not 6 years later. By then I'd finished grad school. I did not see this story until last week. But here's what you learn from it. She reads every issue in advance, every story. She encourages editors to write positive stories. The editors have no fight left in them whatsoever. I've cut out this poor kid's name and the actual quotation. It's too embarrassing. It felt as though the whole journey had been for nothing. And in a way, it got worse. The Rehnquist Court took up the student press again in 1986. It did not overturn Tinker, but Hazelwood said it was okay to censor student publications sometimes. Justice White even used the term publisher to describe the principal. Carol Wacker worked that into her speech at the convention. So now, aren't you really glad you invited me, Frank? I'm making things sound pretty bleak up here. And I confess I did it on purpose because now comes the big turnaround. So you can feel good about your dessert. I'll tell you what I think I learned from my experience as an inept litigant. I learned that it was a fight worth fighting, regardless of outcome. And in fact, that even an outcome like this could fuel a whole career. I learned that principles are important, both the kind with LES and the kind with ALS. And even though principles are important, power is what settles things in the real world. And power became the central focus of my reporting career. Who gets it, how they get it, what they do with it. I think it's among the great themes of journalism, and it calls for close attention to detail. Attention to facts on the ground, to what people do and not just what they say. You could say that my book about Dick Cheney was about almost nothing else. Here was a man who knew exactly what he wanted, pursued it with ruthless attention to detail, and overreached in ways that eventually brought him down. I had learned to pay attention to techniques I first learned from Carol Wacker. Clock watching, misdirection, stealth. And I had learned to verify seemingly obvious fact, not to take that Stevenson quote for granted. The story of Ed Snowden and the NSA is also fundamentally about power, as information is the currency of power. Who gets to decide the secret boundaries of intelligence in a democracy? Well, the secret keepers get to decide, if they're the only ones who know what they're doing. Transparency empowers others to participate in the conversation. Transparency is the threshold condition for functioning markets, political systems, and even judicial oversight. So that means digging for hidden facts can be a vital public service, and defending the right to do that even more so. We don't actually have to win every fight. We have to rise to them whenever the time comes, and we have to offer any light we can to our fellow citizens. So in that spirit, I want to close with something that I can hardly believe myself, and is much more recent. 10 days ago, as I thought ahead to tonight, I decided to do something I had not considered doing before. I tracked down Carol Wacker, who is 80 years old and living in California. I left her a message, and I figured that was probably going to be the end of it. Damned if she did not call me right back. And I recognized that voice as though it had been yesterday. We talked for more than an hour. She remembered everything, almost everything. She said she didn't remember that whole college thing. Her shoes, I probably would not have wanted to remember that either. I don't know how to explain what a strange and surprising conversation we had. She said she thought maybe this was a precursor to my career. She claimed she was proud of me. She said we'd been brave. She said she'd followed my work. She even worried about me a little bit, she said. That Dick Cheney, he's a scary guy. I am not making this up. This I'm making up. We talked a little bit about how scary exactly Cheney is. It's a really good joke. So then she says straight out that she knew what she did was a violation of the First Amendment. It made me feel like I had actually not fought for nothing, that victory takes many forms, that it might not become obvious for years. She tried to explain why it happened. I know it sounds like I don't laugh at this. I mean, she was busy. She had hundreds of teachers. It was a gigantic school, thousands of students. Nothing good could come of a controversial story. Parents would start calling. She didn't want the hassle. I kind of get it. Those words could just as easily be spoken by Bush or Obama or Keith Alexander of the NSA. They're quite confident that they're doing things right. They trust themselves. Who wants someone else to be looking over your shoulder? Anyway, it wasn't really her doing. It was out of her hands. The school board made her do it. Maybe. I mean, her hands were not exactly clear, but they weren't free either. She reminded me, she told me some stories about school board politics, and she reminded me that that kind of thing behind closed doors can direct events in ways we can't know if we don't look really hard to find them. I'm going to come to a close here. if you're going to listen to just one person who is up on the stage tonight, I recommend you listen to Frank. But I'm going to give the last word to Carol Wacker. This is one of the last things she told me before we hung up. I wish there were more people doing investigative journalism, she said. And to that, I think we should all say amen. Thank you.